Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for our Hard Histories conversation. My name is Mallory Pilat. I am a PhD candidate at the History Department in Johns Hopkins. My work explores the phenomenon of Francophilia among Black elite American women between the 1880s and 1920s, from the example of women like Anna Julia Cooper to Josephine Baker. In the past years, I've had the pleasure to work alongside Professor Martha Jones on the Hard Histories project. Launched in the fall of 2020, the Hard Histories at Hopkins project examines the role that racism and discrimination have played at Johns Hopkins. Blending research, teaching, public engagement, and the creative arts, Hard Histories aims to engage our broadest communities at Johns Hopkins and in Baltimore in a frank and informed exploration of the myths that have become part of our university's story, and to offer evidence of how race and racism have shaped Johns Hopkins. In the spring of 2022, we are hosting a series of conversations exploring the histories of Blackness, slavery, and racism in the Maryland area and beyond. Today, we are excited to host a discussion about the vital role of the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper in shaping coverage of Black life in the city. We invite our panelists now to turn their cameras on. We are honored to have with us for our conversation Dr. Kim Gallon and Savannah Wood. Dr. Kim Gallon is an associate professor of history at Purdue University and a visiting associate professor of history of medicine at Johns Hopkins University Medical School. Her work investigates the cultural dimensions of the Black press in the early 20th century and the history of technology, race, and health equity. She is the author of a number of articles and essays, as well as the book Pleasure in the News, African American Readership and Sexuality in the Black Press from the University of Illinois Press in 2020. Gallon is also the author of the field-defining article, Making a Case for the Black Digital Humanities, and the founder and director of two Black digital humanities projects, the Black Press Research Collective and COVID Black. She also serves on a number of digital advisory boards for digital humanities projects and grants. Savannah Wood is an artist with deep roots in Baltimore and Los Angeles. Wood works primarily in photography, text, and installation to explore how spirituality, domesticity, and relation to place shape our identities. Major themes in her work include ancestral research, reframing land as a readable archive, and depicting humans as part of, rather than separate from, the natural world. Her projects reconnect people with the everyday beauty of our world and the histories that lie hidden below the surface. As the executive director of Charities, Wood is creating infrastructure to increase access to the nearly 130-year-old Afro-American newspaper's extensive archives. In this role, she has shepherded the organization through a period of historic growth, initiated new artistic and educational programming, and attracted support from national funders, including the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, and #StartSmall, Jack Dorsey's philanthropic initiative. And finally, Dr. Martha Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, a professor of history, and a professor at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. She directs the Hard Histories at Hopkins project. Martha Jones, Kim Gallon, and Savannah Wood will be in conversation for about 25 minutes, and then we'll turn to your questions. Please submit your questions at any time during the conversation using the Q&A function. Finally, live captioning is available to our audience members within Zoom, and we are also posting a link in the chat to the live transcript URL for those who prefer to access captions that way. Thank you both so much for being here. I will turn the conversation now over to Dr. Jones, and I will see you all at the end of the discussion.
Thanks very, very much, Mallory. It's wonderful to see you. Mallory was such an important part of our lab in the launch year. We miss her, but she's off doing her own research and dissertating. So I'm really glad you could be back with us, Mallory. Thank you so much. And welcome to Kim Gallon and to Savannah Wood. This is a conversation I've been wanting to have for a very long time, I can confess up front, not the least of which because the Afro has turned out to be such a critical resource for our work at Hard Histories. Yes, because it has been one window, right, into the long past of Black Baltimore, but because it has also been incredibly instructive, right, about how archives are created, the perspectives and the biases that they impose on us. And in the lab, as we really were looking to think critically about, for example, our own university archive, or a source like the Baltimore Sun, which I know we'll talk a bit more about, the Afro turned out to be a remarkable and essential resource for us. I spent last semester with 3 students who dug through the first decades of the Afro to understand better how some slices, right, of Black Baltimore were thinking about and engaging with Hopkins. And it turns out to be, as is always true when we do historical work, a more complicated story than we could have imagined going in. So I'm thrilled to have you both here. And I want to just begin by asking you each maybe to talk a little bit about your own path to working with the Afro as an archive, where you are now with that work. Maybe Savannah Wood, would you get us started with that?
I'd be happy to. Thank you so much, Martha. I'm thrilled to be here, and I love talking with Dr. Gallon as well. So I'm just really excited for this program today. So thanks to everybody on your team for making this happen. I would be happy to talk about this. The Afro is my family's newspaper, so I have to start there because I was kind of born into that legacy. And of course, you have a choice of whether or not you want to engage with it in terms of professional life. And so for the majority of my life, I was not very much engaged, save for like a couple of summers staying with my grandmother where she would have us selling the newspaper out on the corner. So that was way back in the early days. But I really had to go on a different kind of journey to get back to this collection. And so my focus, as you heard in my bio, and I'd like to keep that up front, is that I'm trained as an artist primarily. And so it just happened to be that my work in the arts led me to Chicago, where I worked with Theaster Gates and the Rebuild Foundation. And in his practice, he does a lot of work with historical materials. So that was my initial introduction to archives, was actually processing a collection that he had taken on from a couple in Chicago who had been collecting racist memorabilia in an effort initially to take it out of public circulation, which of course is futile since there's just so much of it. But we're sitting in a room for months with 2 other people cataloging that as part of an art practice. So that was the initial kind of bud. Moved back to Los Angeles for a period of time and worked on a project called Radio Imagination, which was stewarded by Clock Shop, a small arts organization. And through that program, we invited artists and writers to engage with Octavia Butler's archive at the Huntington Library. And it was really between those 2 projects where I started to understand how artists and other like non-traditional scholars might engage with historical collections. And through that thinking, just sort of wondered to myself, well, I wonder what the Afro has. And came back to Baltimore to visit my parents when they were still living here, and visited our former building on Charles Street and saw for the first time just the huge amount of archival information that was stored there, and started getting the wheels turning to come back to Baltimore to, continue the work of making that collection more accessible. Oh, you're muted, Martha.
I am. Of course I am. Sorry. I think a lot of us encounter the historical Afro in the digitized newspaper form, right? So one of the things about meeting you for me was appreciating that there was, yes, the newspaper, the text, the published form, right? That, vetted, edited, but there's this whole other universe behind the scenes. So could you say just a little bit about the archive? Because
Absolutely.
it's so much more than the paper.
It is. It really is. So as I mentioned, I really see my work as a continuation of the work that has come before me in making this collection more accessible. There's been a lot of labor going into making the collection navigable. And so you can find the digitized Baltimore newspapers through ProQuest from 1893 to 1988, and then again, 2003 to the present. But that's just Baltimore, so we had editions in DC and Philadelphia, in Newark, and really all up and down the Eastern Seaboard. So those papers we have within the collection, and some of them we have internally digitized. There's the photographs, some of which didn't make it to the newspaper, but show different angles on history. There's about 3 million of those photographs. There are reporters' notebooks, so when you talk about the first draft of history, it's like the real first draft, in their handwriting scribbled in these notebooks. And then there's, just all of the ephemera that comes with living life as, a public figure in an era of, defining Blackness and pushing against establishment. And so there's, the pamphlets from NAACP meetings. There's the National Association of Black Journalists that's there. There's all of these different organizations that leaders and publishers within the newspaper would have attended, would have been a part of, would have been leaders within those spaces. That's also documented. So you have the lives of these people, they're in that fullness documented, and their fraternal organizations and their professional associations, all of that is there. So it really provides a really rich understanding of life, basically, through the time that's documented within the collection, which really spans from the beginning to now, but has a very strong focus, particularly from the 1930s to the 70s. That's where I would say the bulk of the collection is.
Well, I follow you on Instagram, and so I've seen glimpses of this remarkable collection, but I appreciate you sharing that. So Dr. Gallon, I see you nodding, and I want to bring you in here to talk some about your own path to working on the history of the Afro as a historical archive. And I know that is culminating in some really important work for you as a scholar. So let me ask you to at least introduce us to that, if you would.
Yeah, it's so funny to hear you talk about encountering the Afro in a digitized form. I'm going to date myself, and I guess happily so, that I first discovered the Afro when it was on microfilm. I had the great privilege and pleasure of being a librarian at University of Penn Van Pelt Library, and so I would sneak a microfilm home. I bought a microfilm machine off of eBay. So this is way back, and was cranking up microfilm in the evenings working on a dissertation. So I discovered the Afro and the Black press just in general through my work as a graduate student, first as a librarian, but then as a graduate student. And I will say that any historian worth their salt cannot write a history of the Black experience without the Black press. I dare someone to. It is just absolutely essential. And when we talk about the Afro, it is my favorite newspaper, both contemporarily and historically, because of the ways that the Murphy family were just absolutely ingenious in the way that they cultivated a readership, and the way that they've covered, both national news and local news. I like to, because my work is, focused on Baltimore so much lately, and I write about the Afro a lot. It makes up the core of most of my chapters and research in my book. But I like to talk about Baltimore as the city of in-betweens, right? And the Afro reflected that. They were able to, in this era where, Black newspapers understood that their bread and butter solely dependent on readership, right? They didn't have the luxury of getting advertisers because of structural racism. And while they were able to depend on local advertising, they could never really depend on the national advertising that really brought in the big dollars for papers like the Baltimore Sun or the New York Times or Washington Post. And so because Black newspapers had to cast their net widely to attract a diverse group of readers, they had to be everything to everyone. And I think the Baltimore Afro-American, the Afro, was hands down the best at doing that. They were just ingenious in their ability to engage readers across gender and sexuality, across class, across region. They're not solely a Southern paper, but they're not solely a Northern paper also. So they understood that, the paper understood that, and was able to engage both politically, but also socially and culturally in ways that, the Defender and the Courier, in my opinion, and I think the numbers, particularly when we talk about the Defender, definitely start to demonstrate that. By the 1930s, the Defender was not the big paper that it was. It was conservative. It had difficulty keeping up with the times in terms of where people's interests were. And it was the Afro and the Courier that really were the papers to read in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. And so it just became this sort of incredible, rich paper that again spoke to these sort of in-betweens in ways that I just think was unprecedented.
You're reminding me about how when I was working on my early history of Black Baltimore, right, all of which unfolds before the Civil War, if somebody asked you, what is the source you wished you had, right? You'd wished, right, that Baltimore had a presence in the press, right? If Black Baltimore had produced its own newspaper over those years, what a different kind of history I think I certainly would have, I think, been able to tell. It's really one of my laments, and it means I come to the Afro, late in my work because it comes to us in the 1890s. So, Dr. Gallon, if I could probe you just a little bit more about your work, because one of the things you said to me very intriguingly recently was about how you were thinking about the Afro. I think oftentimes we come to the newspapers thinking about political history, right? And you said something to me about the literary that also stretched my idea, right, about the many ways in which we might use this paper. So could you say a little bit more about that piece?
Sure. I mean, and other historians of Baltimore specifically write about Baltimore as a Black city, or talk about the Black experience in Baltimore, may sort of quibble with this, but I would argue that the Afro is the archival record of Black Baltimore, from roughly the early 20th century into the 21st century in so many ways. And I think what the Afro allows, and the Black press in general allows us to do, is to reframe a narrative of the Black experience, for better or worse. And I think there's a great value in framing the Black experience around systemic and structural racism. Absolutely a great value in doing that. But there's a world that Black people build, independent and inclusive of the encounters and engagement with structural racism. And it's the Afro and other papers like the Afro that allow you to understand the worlds that Black people build, right? Where they're not being covered by the sun. So my work right now is looking at the history of a Black writing tradition, a Black reading tradition that is coming through the Afro, but also the Afro is covering this. So I'll give you a good example of this. Is for 40 years, roughly around 1928, there's a rich Book of the Month Club that is somewhat parallel to the National Service, but also sort of running their own reading clubs across the city of Baltimore. And we look at where Black communities and Black people are holding these meetings and hosting people from Johns Hopkins and reading these incredible books and discussing them. It allows us to remap the city, right? So one might map the city around racial covenants and where Black people could live and where they couldn't live. And that's a story that has been told and should be continue to be told. But the Baltimore allows us to map another vibrant experience of where Black bookstores were, right? Where there are Black lecturers at the YMCA, where people are actually selling books as book agents, where they're holding these meetings, where they have writing clubs, right? How they're engaging with Morgan. And I think in the work that I am writing now, I'm asking people to reconsider what they know about Baltimore, which unfortunately continues to be reduced down to, in many places, to some very specific themes. And I'm trying to, through the Afro, ask people to expand their understanding of the Black experience in Baltimore into places that people have yet to really see Baltimore as being known for a rich tradition of Black writing and reading.
Yeah, this is for me, I think one of the insights that began to come to us in the lab as we spent time with the Afro, right, is that we weren't just seeing reflections of Johns Hopkins, the man, the university, the hospital, and more. We were really seeing another world, and we're able then to place some of the histories that we had within that context, right, rather than exceptional or removed from it. So I really, really appreciate that. The other thing listening to you both reminds me of is, you know, one of the things that we've had to navigate under what we hope are exceptional circumstances of pandemic in a research lab is, you know, how to get to the archive, and part of that requires, if I could put it this way, some part of that requires relationships, you know, that we have really benefited from the generosity of librarians and archivists and other safekeepers of historical materials who have worked to either get us access or provide, you know, innovative new ways of accessing the archive. So I hoped I could ask you all like a very basic question, which is sort of how you've come to know each other and how you've sort of worked together. But I ask that in part because I really want to sort of surface for folks what it takes to build those relationships and how meaningful those relationships could be, not just in a mercenary way, like I need to find this photograph, right? But the long term relationships that I think many of us are building, and I certainly think those of us in the lab aspire to build with other folks. So I don't know, maybe I could start with you, Savannah.
Sure.
How do you know this woman, and how is that unfolded? Because I think that's a really important part of the story.
And I'm laughing, we're both laughing because it's been a saga because of many factors. I mentioned our Charles Street building earlier, and that was a site where researchers could easily come in and pull files and sit and be with the collection. And then we moved over to Morgan State University's campus. And again, they were such gracious hosts to us, and a pretty decent size of our collection was also in their library. And so researchers could come there. So I actually met Dr. Gallon for the first time in my small office at Morgan State, which was really wonderful. But then, you know, the pandemic came and universities have their limitations on who can come in. I'm not technically a staff member. There's like state requirements. There's all these things, right? So that made it a little bit more tricky. And also, you know, we are really working to create very expanded access to the collection, which at some point also requires that we have hands-on. So we were rehousing the whole collection, and during that time couldn't pull things for people. So I think it's been this little dance that we've been doing back and forth, trying to make sure that she gets the content that she needs for the work that she's doing while getting our work done as we moved the collection, which is now at a Maryland State Archives facility, but they're not letting us have researchers come on site. So it's all of this stuff. But we're able to pull from the collection again. So we should be able to get you what you need, Dr. Gallon, which is great because it's been a little spotty. Our physical access has been a bit spotty over the past 2 years. But all of this is ultimately building up to the most access that people will be able to have, which is that we're building a permanent home and research center for the collection in West Baltimore at the Upton Mansion, the historic mansion in Upton. And the idea with that site is that there will be a reading room for folks to be able to physically handle materials from the collection, some of the things that we've talked about that are not digitized currently. But that will also have a digitization lab on site where we'll run programming out of that site as well, where members of the community will be able to get trained on these digitization practices and also handle the collection. And it's really a collection that documents Baltimore's Black history. So we need to make sure that Black people in Baltimore are the first people who are able to really handle these things and add to the collection by adding their own recollections to the metadata. So that's a long-winded story, but we're working on it. We're working on it.
We're here for that story. We're here for that story, and we look forward to staying tuned for that journey. I'll remind folks they can drop their questions in the Q&A, but I want to pass it to Dr. Gallon. I guess maybe to get her side of the story and more.
Yeah, so largely what Savannah has mentioned, I had started doing research in the archive when the Afro was on Charles Street, but it moving to Morgan created the wonderful opportunity for me to meet Savannah. And I think, the archivist, the curator, and the historian, the researcher, that relationship, right? In some ways we think of it as the archivist or the curator or the collection builder, does this with the goal of providing access to the researcher, to the public, right? But when you're talking about Black collections and the Black archive, right? The relationship and the historian, the researcher writing about the Black experience, that relationship is often much deeper. I think of people like Arturo Schomburg, Dorothy Porter, who built the collection at Moreland Spingarn. And that relationship is often a much more politicized relationship and a political commitment to recovering Black history and the Black experience, to preserving, right? Often Black archives are significantly underfunded, under-recognized. And I think one of the most beautiful, beautiful things about the Afro, whereas it hasn't been the case with other Black publications, they've been able to hold on to their archive. Now, for some people, that's not important. They're more invested in, or just as much invested in the collection and the archive going somewhere where it can be preserved. And I understand that. And there's good reasons for that. But I think it's important that Black institutions are able to maintain their own archives, to solicit the funding and the support from these philanthropic institutions. So Savannah has just been an amazing advocate for this archive, right? And so our first meeting, she's bringing things out from the archive just as joyful as I am to find it, right? And so there's this joy and this pleasure, I think, that happens between archivists of color, specifically Black archivists, and historians, particularly Black historians, around this recovery. Ida Jones at the Morgan University Archive, same thing. I was there a couple months ago, same joy, same pleasure. You need to do this, and all archivists are helpful, but there is, for Black people who have been unable to maintain or really tell their full history, there is a beautiful joy in a relationship that I find between the archivist, the curator, and the historian and researcher. And this Savannah embodies that in all those ways.
Thank you.
You are telling us what we need to know, and you are taking me back to a moment in my own work where I worked at the archives of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, once in Baltimore City, now in the county. And what I recall is a sort of joy accompanied by terror, because in order to work at the archives of the Oblate Sisters, you must have lunch with the sisters and explain your research, and then take to their podium in the lunchroom and explain your work and endure a sort of grilling. But that, I think, is its own kind of love, if I could put it that way. And so what you're saying, I think, really tells us something important about the culture and the politics and the distinctions between the kinds of archives that we visit when we do our research, not approaching them all as generic or as born of or run by or governed by the same kinds of ethics or sensibilities or even sense of purpose. That there isn't one archive, one archival practice, one archival endpoint. I think that is so important for us, and to recognize that as we approach folks in our own work. So I want to somehow weave Johns Hopkins into this, and maybe that's a mistake, and you could tell me that, because in some ways I'll say that Johns Hopkins as an institution, right, feels interestingly a bit distant from what we've talked about. Importantly, I think, to underscore some of that distance. But I wonder, you all know, you knew who we were and sort of what we're working on. I wonder, maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Gallon, just to ask you, because you've been working this semester with students in the lab, how would you, I don't know, characterize or begin to explain the relationship of Hopkins, perhaps to the Afro, but maybe more importantly, or as importantly, what you're discovering within the archive itself?
Yes, thank you for that question. It's just been an amazing semester working with the students at Hopkins in a Hard Histories course, looking at the way that Hopkins as an institution, Johns Hopkins as a man and as an individual, it was covered, but also sort of constructed. You know, I want to be really intentional with this language about the way that the paper is creating and maybe even recreating Johns Hopkins. And so, you know, what we've discovered is that the Afro in the very truest tradition of the Black press is interrogating and critiquing Johns Hopkins as an institution for its structural and systemic racism in an unapologetic way, right? In a rich way. And what we find is that often the paper is calling or harkening back to Johns Hopkins, the man, as a racial progressive, that he was a liberal, that he was a man of his time, and that his descendants, the people that have inherited, his legacy, are not doing his bidding. That he'd be rolling over in his grave if he could see the way that Black people are treated by Johns Hopkins Hospital, for example. That Johns Hopkins Hospital never intended for Black people to be in segregated wards, that for Black people to receive substandard care, or that there would be Black people working at Johns Hopkins, but only in the very lowest, not lowest, but almost in the working service levels, right? In particular ranks of employment. And so all throughout the 20th century, up into the latter half of the 20th century, we see the Afro making the case that that the institution has not lived up to to the man. And what the students and I are trying to discover, is that a strategy, or does the paper and the readers who are writing and responding to this coverage, do they actually believe that Johns Hopkins was a progressive Quaker that, had he been alive, would have done a better job of creating equity in the city? And we're not sure about that yet. The last thing I'll say is, what's interesting is there's a grudging pride that Black Baltimoreans live in a city with a world-class hospital. And although they're not being treated well by this hospital, there is a sense that this institution is our institution, and that we need to make sure that it lives up to equity and value. And so when there is a Black person that is able to rise in the ranks of the hospital, there's an incredible amount of pride. There's an incredible amount of celebration and coverage. So this in no way is a sort of, creating this sort of antagonistic sort of demonizing Johns Hopkins. We want Johns Hopkins to live up to its better self, the way that its founder would have wanted it to be.
How do you want to answer that question, Savannah Wood?
Well, I will say this, I haven't done a lot of research into the Afro about Hopkins because I just wasn't going there. But I will say that Hopkins hasn't been so far from this conversation in the labor aspects of what we have going on in the archives. So for instance, I think it was 2007, there was a Mellon grant that went to Hopkins to work with the Afro to get to basically create a finding aid for our collection. So that's online and still exists, and is slightly, needs some updating, but is a really great, amazing foundational resource for us to find physical files within the collection. Additionally, right now, there's a joint program between Johns Hopkins and University of Baltimore, also funded by Mellon. So shout out to Mellon for all of that. That's called Inheritance Baltimore, and fellows within that program have been working with us very recently to rehouse the majority of the collection. I won't say the entire collection, but the majority of the collection in preparation for our move to Maryland State Archives. So I just want to mention those two things as ways that Hopkins has been very much involved within our collection. And to say that, in neither of those cases has it felt extractive, as far as I can tell from my research into those processes. And, as we kind of shift into, I think we'll talk about the Sun at a later point also, but just thinking about sort of the reparative work that can happen, and labor support in that way from institutions that have the means, the resources to provide it, is one way to kind of start to build towards more equitable access to resources, opportunities, that sort of thing. So I'll just mention those projects as part of the legacy of the Afro Archives as well.
I appreciate just the way you framed that. And on our Substack, which I invite folks to subscribe to, we're going to chat a little bit this week about, the, I want to call them, important experiments with collaboration and the renegotiation of power. Maybe you all have followed the story at Montpelier and the controversy over the role of descendants in interpreting that place, which has exploded. And I'll talk more about that on the stack this week. And then, at the Baltimore Museum of Art, where we've had the opening of an exhibition curated by the non-curatorial staff at the museum. All of these efforts that are, models for us, experiments, not all successful, but I think you're offering us another way to think about that equation and think about it really carefully. I'm getting some questions here from folks who are tuning in, and thanks to Lauren Feldman, our project coordinator, for making sure I get those. And Savannah Wood, you opened the door to one of them, which is I really did want to hear from both of you about just a few weeks ago now, remarkably, the Baltimore Sun coming public to acknowledge and to begin to reckon with its role in the construction and the promotion of racism and inequality, and more in Baltimore City. I'm not exactly probing you for political commentary, but given where you sit, right, so intimately to the world of the press and how stories about Baltimore have and have not been told, I wondered, I don't know if you would venture a reaction to that. I'll ask Dr. Gallon the same question, but I wanted to ask you first.
Sure. We're in a wave. We're in a wave, and I want to see, how it lands. I don't know. I mean, really, I don't envy their position. Let's start there. I would not want to be in that position to have to do that work. I applaud them for, taking a look at where they've been and listing out what they see as their faults throughout history. I think there is a neat way that the letter wanted to tie things up in a bow as past, and saying like, this is the beginning of a new future, when I think the founding of an organization has so much to do with its legacy. So I think talking about the legacy of this paper is maybe a better way to approach that, because it's deep within all aspects of it. And so I don't know. I mean, I see the letter as attempting to move in a new direction, which is important. I also think, it might be, something in me is telling me like, it might be that you should actually stop for a moment, like actually just stop and then restart with a new ethos. I don't think you can have this continuation, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I haven't seen it happen before.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all new. It's all very experimental. And so it's kind of a wait and see kind of moment. But at the same time, it's like, we'll see. I mean, we'll see. We'll see. And we have our own work to do. So
absolutely.
I'll pop back in and see what's going on when there's things to look at. But that's all I got to say about it. I'll leave it there.
Dr. Gallon, thoughts?
So I should be very transparent and say I'm not a big fan of institutional apologies. I find many of them symbolic. What I will say about the Baltimore Sun is I was pleasantly surprised that it went beyond some of the apologies that I've seen in previous occasions. The paper tries to hold itself as accountable. There are specific instances of coverage that they cite, and as someone who's been doing a lot of research in the Baltimore Sun for the book I'm writing, their coverage is absolutely reprehensible when it comes to Black people, not just Black people, other people of color, poor, people. And so in that sense, I think the Baltimore Sun has absolutely done something important, but the apology is still significantly lacking. It doesn't connect the Sun as an institution to the structural and economic harm in specific terms that it was responsible and is responsible for Black communities. There is a passiveness about it. In the sense that it's, there's a statement that reads, African Americans have been denied equal opportunity and access in every sector of life. And they go on to talk about health, education, but it doesn't say that the Baltimore Sun was based and continues to thrive on white supremacy. That's what makes the Baltimore Sun and many other papers so powerful. It's not that they're just perpetuating and furthering in that sense, but these papers are created out of white supremacist structures, right? So even in their effort to hold themselves accountable, there is very, very little, I would say, that they're talking about in real dollars and cents, right? So the harm, right, of not advertising Black businesses, right? The harm in covering Black people in these reprehensible ways that justify racial covenants, that justify inequity in education, that justify the systematic denial of Black people in just about every aspect of life in Baltimore. Those things will take centuries to actually recover if there's not a radical change, right? And the Baltimore Sun is not advocating for a radical change. We hear nothing about them going into working with Hopkins or the school district or working with the government in terms of redress. The other thing I will have to say is they centered themselves. They talk about the harm that racism did to their business, right? Mm-hmm. To the Sun's business. They don't talk about the Afro and how the Afro was actually pioneering and innovative and well beyond them, light years beyond them in terms of talking about a variety of different issues, talking about international politics, talking about domestic politics, having their absolute pulse on the democracy and what democracy really means. That's what the Black press does. The Black press is the cornerstone of a democratic institution and press. The last thing I'll say, and I always speak passionately about this, is that the Black press can thread the needle of objectivity, but also holding the government accountable in the way that the white press still is not able to do. And so the Sun could have done so much in getting out there and saying, look, it's the Afro that really was the progressive, the paper that was actually out there doing this important work. But they don't, right? And so like Savannah, I'm going to wait and see what the Sun does, but I'm not, overwhelmed with their apology. I think it could have went so much more further.
Yeah. So grateful to you. I'm so grateful to you for just everything that you said. And the reason why, I mentioned the apology in the context of talking about the Hopkins collaborations is because I have a sense that there will be forthcoming requests for collaboration. And I want to remind anybody who might come across this at the Sun that if that is what comes up, recognize that often will benefit the Sun more than anybody else. And so how do you shape collaboration so that within that act, it actually is reparative as well, that whoever you're seeking as essentially a cosigner.
Yes. Well, first,
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt, but one of the first things you do is you ask Black people what they want, right? You start with asking the community, what can we do to repair, to redress this history, all right? And as opposed to just centering and saying, and maybe they did that, so let me.
They did.
Okay, got it. Okay.
They did. I'm just saying on a one-to-one level, and in some ways, there are often invitations to collaborate on things that come to Black people, Black organizations in time of crisis, when white consciousness is awakened, and Black people have been saying the same thing for centuries, but all of a sudden it's news. And there's also an expectation that Black people tell these organizations, these institutions, these individuals what they want. And even that's labor sometimes, so what I would like is for just to put it back in the other direction and say, do your research, come with a respectful, well thought out, creative way that you can be supportive to other people, and then ask, is that sufficient? Is that meeting up with what you'd like, and, there's a way that I talk about this among peers, and it's just a thing that I want to say out loud, that there's a way that after integration happens, people start leaving Black institutions, and this will be probably like another wave of that, the way that they want to be inclusive. If they're actually successful in that, then it'll pull from the Afro's talent pool as well, and so how do you address all of the harm that you've caused without then putting a legacy institution under in the process because you have more access to resource? So, just some things to consider.
It's tremendous because I'm listening to you both, and there's a way in which I think with some seriousness, I could substitute Johns Hopkins for the Baltimore Sun. and we'd be having a really on point, right, critical reflection, I think, about the Sun, about Hopkins, but about so many of Baltimore's institutions that have approached and engaged, right, with the kind of reckoning that has long been overdue and was so powerfully manifest in the summer of 2020. I'm somebody who takes phone calls from city leaders who are looking to find their institutional way to this work. And I think this exchange for me is essential listening for folks who are attempting to do that work and do it in a serious way. I do think there's something afoot, if I could put it that way, in Baltimore City when it comes to this work. But many of us are coming to it structurally and willfully naive, right, about how actually to approach it in ways that are that have integrity and that are meaningful and that have the possibility, right, of transformation and not simply of window dressing. So I think to be continued. Okay, I'm remiss here because the questions are coming in, and this is such a great conversation. I want to share a comment from an appreciation from our friend Lisa Monroe, who says Professor Gallon gets at a significant role the Afro played in documenting or really being in conversation with the Black community and our everyday lived experiences locally and nationally. And this is the reflection. The Afro was an institution like a church, like civic groups, like neighborhood associations, what you heard at home or on the front porch, you heard a confirmation of and a continuation of in the Afro. The Afro was a printed record of what you learned through friends and family, and essential in constructing and educating Black community. I think that's really an affirmation
and beautifully stated too.
Beautifully put. Positioning, right, of the Afro in the history of the city and more. I do have a question.
Can I?
Oh yeah, by all means.
Can I say one thing?
Of course.
I also just want to point out, I appreciate, Lisa, that you said the Afro was an institution, but also is an institution, you know, that it's a very present day publication that's still here and still online and in print. Thank you. Thank you. Essential. I appreciate that. Gabrielle Dean wants to know a little bit more about the archive. I do too. And writes, would love to know more about the Afro's ventures into book publishing. She's engaged in collecting materials related to Black Baltimore, and she comes across titles like The Ethiopian's Place in History and His Contribution to World Civilizations, The Negro, the Hamite, the Stock, the Stems, and the Branches. I'm seeing the nods. You all know this. You want to say a little bit more, Savannah, about this facet, both of the Afro's history and of the archive? Yeah. So John Henry Murphy Sr., my great-great-grandfather, was a printer, first and foremost, you know, so that's how he comes into the Afro. And so in addition to printing our newspaper, they also did print jobs. So in an early photograph on at the Utah Street location, it says Afro-American Printing Company and Afro-American Ledger, which was the name at the time. And so printing for other groups, other organizations, publishing has been, or was particularly at that time, part of the business model. And then they got into just doing the newspaper and just doing publications that were initiated by the Afro. But you know, this continues to this day. We just did a self-published book in 2020 featuring Dr. Martha Jones that was published by the Afro and Afro Charities together, called To the Front, Black Women in the Vote. Yeah, superb. Let me, I've got to wrap us up, but I want to share a last comment from Keisha Ha, and I appreciate Keisha Ha being here again and always offering us, I think, important critical thinking about these conversations. And
this begins more of a comment, but Dr. Gallon's speculation behind the motivation of the Afro's editorial stance that the trustees and institutions betrayed the intent of the man, Ms. Cummins says, had little support. If nothing exists about the strength of that relationship, would it be more prudent to work from the basis that the Afro was more likely than not simply passively urging an appeal to Hopkins' moral strivings, knowing the power that Hopkins wielded? I guess that opens up, sort of the politics of the paper itself. And if I could put this in the most polite vein, the propaganda, right? The myth making that goes on. And so we have just a couple minutes, but I didn't want to miss a chance for you all to comment on that before we wrap up, and I'll hand it off to Mallory. Dr. Gallon?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with there's a strategic positioning and use of Johns Hopkins. We don't have empirical evidence that, where someone, unless it's in the archive, and Savannah will tell me at some point where someone, is writing down like, we're going to, use this in this way and position, but certainly all the context in which the Afro was writing about white supremacy, and both nationally and then locally, would suggest that absolutely these are rhetorical devices to call on the institution, to shame the institution for its racism, and to hold them accountable. So I would absolutely agree with that. And I think it's ingenious. I think most of the time when we look at the readers, they also share that sentiment or responding to it. So there's some wonderful articles about, again, literally saying, Hopkins would be rolling in his grave, or that Hopkins wouldn't be able to even come to his own sort of trustee meeting because he was too progressive for the, the institutional holders in the 1920s and 30s.
That's fantastic. I'm going to give you the last word, Savannah Wood, and then I'm going to pass it back to Mallory.
Okay, well, I'll just say that I think we know that Black people in particular speak several languages at once. And so there's always other things to read between the lines. And so I would just leave that with anybody who's doing research within the collection, that there's many levels to what's documented there. And that's that. That's all I'll say.
It's tremendous. Mallory, I'm going to hand it back to you to take us out this afternoon. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to Kim Gallon, Savannah Wood, and Martha Jones for this incredibly rich conversation. We're honored to have had you here, and we appreciate the way that your research sheds light on the questions that we are asking at the Hard Histories at Hopkins Project. Your conversation really made me reflect in particular on the way that we can and should think about archives creatively, and read, in this instance, a newspaper as a multifaceted lens into the past. And I'm also thinking about how the archive is very much a living thing and a work in progress that brings us into the present, as both of your works show. And of course, as ever, this is a tremendous reminder of how central the Black press is to much of our work, and to my work in particular. So thank you very much for your work and for such a generative conversation. And thank you to our audience for watching and for sending in your great questions, and to the team at the SNF Agora Institute for their support of this event. During these conversations, we have the chance to share what we're reading, and we're also interested in what you're reading. What sources have helped you to better understand the hard questions we are asking at the Hard Histories Project? Share them with us and help build our collective Hard Histories bibliography. Let other members of the Hopkins and Baltimore community know about books and articles that are helping you sort through the history of enslavement and more. You can reach us on social media with the hashtag GHU Hard Histories, or at our email address, hardhistories@jhu.edu. We look forward to hearing from you and learning from you too. You can learn more about Hard Histories at Hopkins at hardhistory.jhu.edu. Additional information about our event series, as well as YouTube videos of our past events, is posted at snfagora.jhu.edu/event. Please also subscribe to our Substack at hardhistoriesjhu.substack.com. where we regularly post updates about what we're up to. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.